Okay, so this is Paul Williams, Blogging Theology, and this is Hassan Minia, and he's talking about the subject, did Islam spread by the sword? And he's going to quote this writer named Kennedy, and I want you to hear this because it's really interesting what he says.
There's an interesting quote by Hugh Kennedy, who has done a lot of research and writing about the early Muslim conquest, in which he says, Islam did not spread by the sword, but without the sword, it could not have spread, right?
Right? So there's A and not A. So was Islam spread by the sword or not by the sword? It's kind of an interesting statement to say that Islam is not spread by the sword because for 1400 years we can find battle after battle after battle, and some political, some civil, some internal strife, some are things that are just from natural occurrences. One that comes to mind is the Janus Rebellion of, uh, of the East African slaves from 689 to 694. They rebelled against their Muslim captors. There's estimated from 1.5 million to 2.5 million casualties from this one rebellion of these East African slaves against their Muslim captors. In the Battle of Basra in 694, they say 300,000 casualties were caused by that one war. And this is not so much the spread of the sword, it's the rebellion that Islam creates when it conquers a land. And we see this in many, many battles and throughout as Islam spread. One of the points that he brings up is that when Islam spread from 632 after Muhammad died to 732, that in 100 years, Islam went from just a tiny dot in the Middle East, and all of a sudden their governing lands went from all the way from Iran all the way to Spain. And he says that Muslims were a minority, and so think about it. They took over these lands as a minority. They ruled with their military might, and even though there was no mass conversion or forced conversions, they eventually, through financial compulsion, they were able to tax these non-Muslims into becoming Muslims because they saw the advantage of being a Muslim over a non-Muslim and to retain some of their wealth. So I see that as an aspect of the conversion factors. Also, when after they converted, it was illegal for Muslims to become non-Muslims. So you see that. And then also Muslims are allowed to have 4 wives and they can have large families. And that also increased the amount of Muslims into your communities. So with that, we see that Islam is not so much complex as that when you start dissecting it, you see that the sword is the major component about the expansion of Islam.
Through intermarriage, through trade, and through migration, and through his social influence, right? So that is essentially an example of Islam spreading to Christchurch, New Zealand.
So if you check, Islamic immigration began in the 1990s from refugees from various war-torn countries such as Bosnia and Iraq. The first Islamic center opened in 1959, and there are now several mosques and 2 Islamic schools. Now notice the word fixated, as used by the Muslim historian.
He was fixated on the Battle of Kosovo in a faraway place in the Balkans from the year 1389.
That's absolutely not true. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389 was only one thing written on his rifle. There was 8 other men, the names of men, written on his assault rifle. Plus, if you read the manifesto never mentions the War of Kosovo. Okay, so see how he's slanting the motivation from this killer to hurt people in a country that he doesn't even live in, to try to say that it was a war in the 14th century that motivated this guy to commit a crime. It's not really true.
If you ask someone how did Islam spread, it's sad that they feel very comfortable saying Islam spread by the sword. That this is not something that is very accurate.
Oh, I think it is a very meaningful way. Did Islam spread by the sword? And the answer is yes. It's not a complex answer, but it is kind of does summarize how Islam spread. How else would this guy explain it? How is it complex? I don't see invasions by Muslim army as being complex at all.
Is others. Similarly, when we look at past figures, we should look at the complexity and the context in which they were up.
Okay, so the complexity of Islam is when Muhammad died, you had ridda wars. So you had Muslims killing Muslims. After that, they developed their armies because they were pretty good at slaughtering their own people. They started to go to Persia, and then they went to Turkey, and then they took over Egypt, took over Christian lands, took over Coptic churches, started spreading across northern Africa. They came to Morocco. They saw Spain having some serious problems. They invaded Spain. They took over Spain and tried to take over the French city of Toulouse, and they lost that battle. And they tried to take over the French city of Tours, and they lost that battle. And so all of a sudden, 100 years after Muhammad died, came the idea that maybe they aren't a free roaming army to take over the world. They kind of hit resistance with Charles Martel. But they did go ahead and try to invade Sicily, and they went as far as China. There's very few places that Muslims can say they went in peace.
Is a subject which you mentioned on page 7 of your article, Did Islam Spread by the Sword? You referred to the famous treaty between the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the second Muslim caliph who died in 644. So this is the early 7th century, really to read what this actually said. And you actually quoted from Professor Hugh Kennedy, this British historian again, from his book, The Great Arab Conquest, How the Spread of Islam Changed the World We Live In, from 2007. And he writes, he quotes from this famous treaty, which goes as follows, in part anyway. This is the assurance of safety which the servant of God, Umar, the commander of the faithful, that's what the caliphs were called then, has given to the people of Jerusalem. He has given them an assurance of safety for themselves, for their property, their churches, their crosses, the sick and healthy of the city, and for all the rituals which belong to their religion. Their churches will not be inhabited by the Muslims and will not be destroyed. Neither they nor the land on which they stand, nor their crosses, not their property, will be damaged. They will not be forcibly converted. So says the famous treaty between Sophronius, the Patriarch of Jerusalem, and the second Muslim caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, who died.
Okay, so this is a treaty between Jerusalem and Islam leadership. And the thing that it doesn't reflect is that future Muslims treaties would be doing the opposite. They will be taking churches, Christian lands, taking booty, really raping the Christian communities. And that happened in Egypt, that happened in North Africa, that happened in Spain, that happened in Turkey. Even today, we have famous churches that have been converted to mosque. And so this shows the hypocrisy of Islam, and it's very clear. And if they don't mention it, I don't know how they can honestly say these things of how peaceful Islam is when it's exactly the opposite.
That was a precedent-setting agreement, and in many other cases in Islamic history, when you find this kind of
Okay, the precedence is set, but Muslims ignored it. When the Muslim forces went against Constantinople, they went against them in sieges. I believe 3 times they tried to siege Constantinople, and 3 times they failed. On the 4th time, they finally did it. They won the city. They took over the lands. They took over the churches. They raped the communities, and this is Islam at its best.
Negotiation happening between Muslims and non-Muslims for a peace agreement in newly conquered areas. That wording is very familiar. So when you read about it in different cities.
So this is called lying. Very, very deceptive. when no one went into Spain and said, "Oh, we love you. We're not going to take your lands. We're just going to be peace-loving people. We'll buy a piece of land and build a mosque." That just did not happen. They didn't do that in Turkey. It's a bunch of baloney. I just can't believe this guy talking and saying this with a straight face.
Situations such as in Spain in the early 8th century, if you have read the Pact of Umar, you immediately sense that ring of familiarity that I have heard this kind of wording before. So it was a very impactful document, and even to this day, it really informs much of the conversation about how Muslims, when they are in positions of influence, are to engage with sort of non-Muslim minorities.
Okay, so he makes reference to something about Spain, but if he read the Moors of Spain, he would realize that there is a total deception in what he's just said. The Moors of Spain came from Morocco, they came to Spain, and they raped the land, they stole the land, they stole the booty, they oppressed the people, they taxed them so much so they can build many, many mosques. For 800 years, the golden era of Islam in Spain, Iberia, was set in motion, and not one church was able to be built in 800 years. That's total oppression, and that's why the people rose up 800 years later in the Spanish Inquisition, and they rebelled against the Sultan of Cordoba, as he was an evil, evil man that was persecuting the people, wouldn't allow Christian communities to build their churches and proselytize Muslims. They would not allow it. The Jan's rebellion in 869 to 883 by Asabad Caliph in Basra in Iran, where East African slaves rebelled. And then from 689 to 694, we have 1.5 to 2.5 million African and Muslims killed. Both sides looted and executed captives. About 300,000 were killed in one day in the Battle of Basra. So the Jasserites were a member of the elite corps in the standing army of the Ottoman Empire from the late 14th century to the 1826. Jasserites began their elite corps made up of through the divine system of child levy, by which Albanians, Armenians, Bulgarians, Croats, Greeks, and Serbs were all taken, levied
which
and
you will come
subject to
across
circumcision
very
and
quickly if you
conversion
read
to
Ottoman
Islam.
history. And these were young boys, essentially, who were taken from their families in a systematic way. So not just rounded up and taken, but like boys of a certain age, and a sort of system of circulating among villages, and every 10th boy, and the system fluctuated over time. But the point is, there was a system. It wasn't just the whims of a particular individual, etc. And these boys, nevertheless, they are taken from their families, which were usually Christian families in the Balkans, and they were then raised as Muslims. So essentially, converted to Islam by force, of course, because their parents obviously were not involved in the process, or people who could rightfully be considered their guardians were not involved in that decision for them, and the children themselves were often too young to be making such a decision for themselves as well. So they are now raised as Muslims to be part of the Janissary force, which was essentially the Ottoman Sultan's personal guard. And they were raised in this way, so again, I've described it up to a point so far, but now I'm about to say they are raised in this way because, right? And this is the point that we are trying to make here, not denying that it was a horrific process, it was a disruptive process for families and communities, that, there was a lot that was, in violation of perhaps Islamic teachings there, as well as, we would all be sort of morally offended if we were to see this happen, right? Not denying any of that, or sort of the gravity of this, but the context is always important to understand why something happened, how it happened, right? And if we in our own time were to take some lesson from that situation to see, how we would behave differently or make decisions differently, it would be important for us to know all of those relevant details. So now I'm going to say the purpose of this system was to have a personal guard for the Ottoman Sultan that could be more relied upon to be loyal to the Ottoman Sultan than perhaps the Turkish core of the Ottoman army, which had other sort of networks of relationships within that society that might prove to be unreliable. Certain segments of that army might be proved to be unreliable for the Ottoman Sultan in different, in sort of like fluctuating political context, etc. But because these individuals were raised, for a very very particular purpose and very rigorously trained, they could be expected to be more reliable. So that is the whole purpose of the system. The system in a way, effectively became a social ladder for many of the individuals, the young Christian boys who were put through it. So they're raised as Muslims, and many of them they reach sort of positions of influence within society, right? All when you actually look into the context of Imam Yahya himself, the person who issued this decree, and all of the different factors at play. So after issuing the decree, and there was a very political purpose for which he was issuing the decree, it was a way that he figured that he would exert his authority and in a sort of overall colonial context, and establishing his position vis-a-vis the British and all of these other, geopolitical factors that are at play. He puts this decree in place, and he himself is violating his own rules and actually helping Jewish children escape the kind of persecution that he has sort of, in theory, mandated in writing, right? And providing all kinds of leniency, and there's all kinds of loopholes and gaps in the implementation, etc. To the point that despite all of this being known about Imam Yahya, to this day even he's still very favorably seen by the Jewish community, right? Despite being aware of this, because they know the text and they know this sort of how kind of dislikable the language and the message of the text is, but they also know the reality, right, of what actually happened historically. So the orphans decree in Yemen is this moment of forced conversion, certainly, and certainly, there was forced conversion in some cases of these Jewish children, but there is a larger story, right? And all we are asking, all the purpose of my article was to say, let's look at the bigger picture. Let's be serious. Let's not be disingenuous about this. Let's not just weaponize, very generalized historical narratives for whichever purpose that we would like. But let's actually try to get a more realistic, more holistic look at the history, which is always complicated.
Thank you.
Yeah, history is very complicated.
And Jesus said, "Watch out for false prophets. They will come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruits you will know them."